That took a second. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second part of our World War II episode on democratization. Don't worry,
we are not. Think first time, not late by 2 seconds. Literally no late in chat.
Yes, it's just turned 01, so technically we were exactly on time. Let me put a refresh note, because YouTube's a bastard for not starting streams, I will say. YouTube's a bastard. In general, I've just not been able to access the back end for about half an hour. I've been having fucking kittens about getting this stream working.
Imagine Scrump not being able to access the back end.
Hey. Let's get the normal YouTubey things out the way first. We are, by some miracle, still monetized. So you can still join as a member, you can still send super chats, and you can still donate through Streamlabs, which is the best way to support the stream and support the channel. The link is in chat, and it is the pinned image, the pinned message in the chat. Sorry, there's also links in the description where you can find basically everything. You can find the links to my social media, Trig social media, a link to Evelyn's stuff as well. Hoping to. Yeah.
At this point, why aren't we just saying smash that like button? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment in the chats as well, because it really helps out, to keep the conversation going.
No. We're not being Tim Pool.
Aw, he makes so much money though.
The thing is, I didn't used to work for Viceor Fusion, so I can't do a Tim Pool impression, really.
No, fair enough.
Oh dear. God, we're actually getting towards the end of the series, really, now.
We are. This, in theory, it's this, then a end of the war till 1950s. Is that it? I think that's kind of what we scheduled.
Well, I think we might still have a few special episodes in between. I'm thinking we do actually not a part 3, but we do a consequences of World War II. Yeah. Then we do 45 to 50, because we're going to have to do, I think, that basically over 2 streams. And again, 2 hours each again. So we're making these a little bit shorter, a bit more digestible.
There's almost a post-war consensus kind of thing to do. And maybe a where do we go from here, although that would kind of assume we're in the 1950s still.
Well, the thing is, we're going to have to... what I want to do is I actually want to, at some point as well... Again, I know I'm shilling here too. I need to put the Nomos events thing in there somewhere.
Yes, you do.
I'll put it in the description, I'll put it in chat. But yes, we are going to start holding more in-person events. I'm speaking at the Shieldings event, as I talked about in that video, and I'm also... organize my own event. We've sold a third of the tickets already, so if you guys want to come, do be quick. But yeah, I'll be speaking literally on the subject of where do we go from here at the end of this month at the Shieldings event. And I'm also probably going to record and upload, not me speaking there, but a proper video essay with proper, slides and visual aids to the channel. So, yes, we are going to talk. We've already talked a little bit about the Nuremberg trials. Sutton has a very spicy take about that, about the fact that the people who were economically responsible for the war really weren't punished. But we will be talking a little bit more about kind of the post-war punishment ethic when we talk about the consequences of World War II next week, and then we'll talk about 1945 to 1950. And I don't know, we might have some specials just purely about theory and about laying out what we think should replace the systems of mass democracy and some of the alternatives, and maybe reaching back into the past and talking about a lot of some of the pre-1900 stuff on democracy. We've got a lot to cover. I'm going to space that out between our, I guess, normal streams, even though these kind of are our normal streams now. There are a lot of different subjects we need to cover. We need to get into basically a lot of the esoteric stuff too. I know there's been requests for about 5 weeks for the Hyperborea stuff, the astrotheology stuff, some of the more fried, as Evelyn puts it, stuff.
You are not going to be able to stop me doing an Hyperborean special, at least. I think we have to do at least one. And yeah. Because the moment I started digging on this, it's glorious. I'm just saying.
It's great to get into, I think, some of the esoterica. I would like to cover some of the weirder stuff that people talk about, because it is like I said, it is just generally very interesting. But for the moment, we are still in World War II. We're still covering World War II. And last time, really, we talked about what got us to 1939.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, it really was to really cover the premise of the war and the way the war was framed. We're going to talk a little bit more about the events of the war during this one. And I know you, Trig, you have a lot of your spiel. So I don't know if you want to start off and talk about kind of your thoughts about, the glories of World War II and a bit more detached from the series. Because I know you have your whole World War II enthusiasm. So I'll let you go.
Look, I can get into this. There's an awful lot of stuff about jet fighters and tanks and technology and computers and so on. And there's a huge myth, and I'm going to say that loosely, myth, that the World War II create technology that actually helps civilization. And there's actually quite a large, I'm going to go with myth that war is good in many respects for humanity, and in fact that the Second World War drove us forwards 100 years in technology. That's all fucking bollocks. Yeah, Sir Frank Whittle was creating a jet engine well into the early 1930s. The Germans essentially stole his homework, and in 1938-39,
yes,
there was 2 jet engines in production. One in Germany, which was essentially a not as good, basically sort of I've copied your homework version of Sir Frank Whittle's. The Germans put it into a fighter quicker, by about 6 months, but that's because war economy, etc., etc. But yeah, the tanks were already on the framework. The computers were already well underway, and to be honest, if war transformed computers, then explain the last 1970s through till now. There was no war essentially driving that, and that's the most incredible technological boost we've seen ever in terms of computing.
It is in terms of computing, but the field, like I said, there's something I want to cover when we get to some of the later part, if we do get to the post-democratization stuff, that really a lot of technologies, apart from computing, stagnate. And the futurism as imagined in the 50s and 60s, we really aren't there.
Well, no,
and the pace of
Sorry, we had rockets. We had rockets in the 40s and 50s, which really people went, holy crap, the stars are at our fingertips.
Yep.
And it's been a long stretch, but we haven't had the warp drives that we were promised.
No, it's again what to quote Evelyn again. She refers to that as Faustian space nonsense, which I do kind of agree with. It really is the fact that once you do get to the 1950s, you get all these people who disappear into their own fantasies rather than dealing with the world around them.
Yes and no. I don't like to buy into that. I'm quite a I'd like to have a positive outlook on life, and there was a lot of stuff that we haven't pumped money and research into that we could have done, that could have taken us a lot further. Space stations could have been taken a lot further. We could have built, and I've rabbited for hours on one of Oozler's streams a year ago about this, we could have built floating cities that would float around in Earth, according to Buckminster Fuller. Back in the 1950s, had we had enough aluminium to actually build one, and we've certainly got the technology now. We could have floated one of those over to Venus by now and had it sitting in the stars. Literally, Cloud City space stations. Not a problem. But
it's whether or not there's the real desire for that and the resources for that. But it's a slightly separate issue. But yeah, there was that spirit, especially after World War II, which we'll get into, of that there was this almost paradise brought about by the end of the war. And there was this great kind of like mass jubilation and this great feeling that really was exploited to create the post-war consensus.
I mean, to be fair, America hadn't had the war on its doorstep, but certainly Europe had a shitty old time for 4 or 5 years. I mean,
yes,
wildly shit time. Bombs dropping from the air, blowing up your next door neighbor. Type sort of tier shitty. The stopping of that, and suddenly people going, hey, check out this TV. Hey, check out this car. You can have this now. Isn't this incredible? Stuff was happening post-war. And I can understand people feeling a little bit positive for the future. I'm not gonna deny them that. And well, we can get into the politics of how stuff was swindled onto that feeling of elation that bombs were no longer dropping from the sky, and how we lost a huge amount of freedom in the process. But maybe that's for another episode. But that did definitely happen. NHS, cough. Taxation, cough. But
well, yes,
I can understand people feeling good at the end of the war. The war was pretty fucking horrible.
Of course, yeah. But it's really a result of like mass psychological warfare that went on, like domestically in both the US and the UK. Again, which we will somewhat go into. But there was this really the result of the war isn't possible without the war. Again, like we talked about with World War I, in that what happens is the change that the elite strata and the emerging kind of dominance of the managerialists, as we talked about last time, isn't possible without the war. Yeah. And as we talked about previously, the war is something that pretty much everyone involved wanted and thought would be good. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail here by the fact that more events-wise, we will kind of have to talk about the axis and the supposed aggression, where the aggression was, who the aggression was by, and a lot of the versions of history we see, especially with World War I, which have faded somewhat now, were to do with German aggression, and that has been replaced by the inevitable tragedy of treaties and the elite families of Europe, and it all becomes quite confusing with World War I education now. But World War II is still very, very much, as we left it off last time, it has its historiography passed on by the propaganda of the time.
The inevitability of the Second World War, how it had to happen because of X, Y, and Z. Well, it didn't, but it did, because it did. It's as simple as that. I mean, does history heal itself? Etc.
There's a contradiction in the kind of classical reading of the Second World War. That the Second World War is simultaneously wholly the fault of Nazi Germany and the Japanese, but it is also an inevitable war. Those things don't glue together, really.
They don't, do they? I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, the Allies fucked up the Treaty of Versailles, therefore the Second World War was inevitable, and that Mr. Hitler was evil. It was all his fault. Well, they kind of created him, didn't they? I mean, literally created, funded, etc.
Well, we get the idea. We hinted at last time that two countries invaded Poland. One was our ally, and we went to war with the other one because of it.
Yeah. And Poland got it right up the jacksie with no lube by the end of it as well. Because let's face it, we went to war to save Poland, and Poland, at the end of the war, was fucked and well and truly in the possession of the Soviet
Yes,
Union.
It really is then for no reason at all.
Very sad. I feel for the Poles. I have a lot of respect and good feelings for the Polish. I mean, Vienna, winged hussars, etc. Big feels. They have saved Europe so many fucking times, and they've taken it in the butt repeatedly for it. It seems, thanks to certain groups.
Yeah, they have. It's a bit of a shame.
To say the least, a bit, yes. Damn it.
The issue is, though, when it comes to the axis, the idea of the axis, it is almost entirely a creation of the Western propaganda machine.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're finally actually going to talk a little bit about Imperial Japan. I don't have any sources here, really, because this is just accepted history. But the Imperial Japan was actually in a very similar position to Germany before the First World War, in that Japan thought it was owed its colonies. everyone was still looking to Britain as the superpower and was looking to America as the economic superpower. And they were saying, why can't we do what you do? Why can't there be Greater Japan like there is Greater Britain? Why can't there be, a world stage for Japan's economy like there is for America's economy? And there is a lot to be said for the fact that they thought that this was their time and this was their century. And the Japanese ambitions, they are only really nominally allied with Hitler. They ally with Hitler because they think that they need to achieve their goals, but there is never the close coordination. There is never a coordinated battle in which Italian, Japanese, and German troops fight as one, like with like the Americans and French and British did in the D-Day landings.
No, never.
The Axis as a direct counterpart to the Allies is a myth. And it really is the era of globalism versus, nationalism. And the nationalist sides, yes, they did perpetrate war crimes. All sides created war crimes. And it's, you get people who get very angry with you saying that still. You get people very angry with you suggesting that maybe the Second World War was a war between nations with their own problems, their own issues, but ultimately was not a war between good and evil, like we talked about last time.
I would even argue that certainly in the case of the Nanjing, the rape of Nanjing, I don't know if people know about this. It's not a pleasant story. I don't recommend you eat it or eat before reading this, and certainly it wouldn't be something I would tell your kids. But Japan was invading China during these troubled times, and it took the actions of a Nazi present in Nanjing who wrote to Hitler and went, look, the Japanese are doing X, Y, and Z. And, I'm not going to even mention it because we'll get demonetized if I talk about Nanjing. Yeah. Because it is wildly unpleasant. The Japanese, I would argue the Japanese were the real bad guys in World War II on some levels. Because, man, they did some horrific things.
Well, the problem is with things like Nanjing is that we actually don't know what happened there. What we actually have, and I've been researching this, is a propagandized version. The estimates of the death toll in Nanjing is between 40,000 and 300,000.
Yes.
There was the brutal sack of Shanghai, but as we'll get into, basically the Soviet Union committed war crimes in every single country they touched during World War II.
Oh, yes, they did.
That always would rival what the Japanese did.
Yeah.
It just isn't talked about.
Oh, no, I've heard stories of the Soviet Union's literally eating people. And I've literally, not eyewitness, but shall we say secondary accounts from eyewitnesses of cannibalism perpetrated by the Soviet Union armed forces. Whether that was because they were half-starved, or whether it was a terror tactic, I don't know. Either way, it's not nice.
The problem is that everybody points their fingers everywhere else when it comes to war crimes in the Second World War. Everybody has a case for everybody else being a monster. Yet the version of history we are fed is that there was the Axis, there was the Allies that were equivalent to each other in coordination, which is not true. The Axis were evil nationalists, and that the Allies were virtuous UN-founding globalists. And you can start to see the problem with that version of history as we look at the modern times. It is exactly what you would expect from a self-serving kind of managerial class of people. It's exactly what you expect from a class of people who want global democracy. They want a one-world government. They do. They state so much out. That's what the UN was eventually and is still meant to be.
Yeah.
There is meant to be, and as we see it expanding, all this global governance. And so, even the image of the Axis is something that you have to get out of your head. There's also, I don't have it here to hand. I have a copy of it, and we may cover it in detail at some point. We don't have time, I'm afraid, as is usually the case. But if you read Mussolini's biography, you will also find out that Mussolini was very suspicious of Hitler. He never liked the Nazis, and again, it was an alliance of convenience mostly.
Because he was deeply untrustworthy of Hitler. In fact, he started building a giant fortification across the northern end of Italy.
Yes, I know you have a link to that one, Trig.
I've got pictures of big sets of dragon's teeth and fortifications because he thought, oh, this mad Charlie Chaplin looking fucker is going to invade me. I don't trust this guy at all. I'm going to build defenses. And by the way, France, Germany, it's not Germany, France, guys, do you want to get in on this? And they all went, no, we kind of trust him.
I can't hear it because of Discord's noise limit, but apparently there's some breathing noises coming through in the stream, so you might want to move your mic a teeny bit.
I will move my mic. There we go. That might help.
Sorry, that is a known problem with Trig's mic. Apologies on the recording if that's relatively present. I can't actually hear it here, but I know that does happen sometimes.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
I'm sorry for breathing. I will stop
You are
breathing.
correct, and that's again, it's another aspect of the fact that the Axis, again, is a propaganda creation. A book that we do have here, and one that I have again been scrambling to read in its entirety. I haven't read it all, but I've skimmed most of it and I've read the conclusions in detail. There's a huge reading list. I need to start posting the notes for this. I'll basically be posting 3 shows worth of notes at the same time later this week. I'm just trying to polish them up and get them into a state where they're more readable, because our notes have been a little bit more scattered recently as we've been a bit more pushed for time. I like to have them in a readable format. I know you guys like reading along, so I'm sorry that those haven't been present recently. Sorry, there's also a $5 donation here from Gaius Naughty Seas. Thank you for that. Hot take: we should have let Imperial Japan keep its territory gains in China. Maybe not let them keep it, but maybe have applied economic pressure like the Americans did and continued to do. Again, another aspect in the lead up to the Second World War is the mass sanctioning of Japan, and in that without attacking in the Pacific, Japan would have run out of petroleum within months. It was really an act of desperation due to sanctions as well, which is again something not talked about.
Yes, Japan were put into a situation. Okay, they were engaging in a war, across China and various other places, but they were put into a position where they had to attack Pearl Harbor. They could have pushed further down to Indonesia, because there was huge oil fields down there that were owned by Shell at the time. Incidentally, read The Prize or watch the TV, the YouTube. It's on YouTube. A series called The Prize, very very good. It talks about the oil wars and the progression of oil through the last century. It is very very. It's good side reading to what we're talking about, because oil is a massive factor to all of this.
Yes.
But yeah, they were pushed into a point where they had to cut down their trees and make oil out of trees and fuel out of trees. The Japan were forced essentially to attack Pearl Harbor, and I kind of believe they were suckered into it.
Well, they weren't forced to attack. They were forced to take action. Again, there's the source here we've got is a good one. It's a book by a guy called Victor Surov or Surov. I can never say people's names right. And it's called The Chief Culprit. It is about how Stalin had pushed throughout the 30s for a war. Again, we don't have time to get into all of it. I would advise you to read the book. It's a very good book. This was on a good reading list I got from the Mises Institute. Again, we're not in any way associated with them, but big thank you to them, because they make a lot of these resources available online for free. But it's about the war as, created in many ways by the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union very much wanted the Second World War. The idea of, again, it goes into the idea of the German blunder of, if it weren't for the damn winter and all that, is again a bit of a misconception, because there was a massive armed buildup on the Polish border. They were actually preparing to attack the Germans, and the Germans actually counterpunched them and smashed a lot of that very, very quickly. They shouldn't have continued, but they did manage to smash that quite quickly.
There's an argument to be made that if Germany had waited 6 months and let Russia hit first, the whole situation would have been the Allies would have backed Hitler against Germany, against Russia, rather than the other way around, and that would have been an interesting way for history to have played out. Certainly, but it didn't. So we'll carry on.
I'm at chapter 44 here, called The Model War.
I have it.
And it highlights one of the points that is very important. It starts, a Soviet historian's account of Japanese-German relations in World War II went as follows. The German leaders had especially strong expectations of their Japanese allies. They really wanted Japan to be be the first to start military action against the USSR, but the Japanese leaders evaded talks with Germany. Only in March 1941 did the Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Matsuko, arrive in Berlin. Matsukoa, again, I'm terrible with names.
Matsukoa.
Refused to determine the deadline for Japanese action against the USSR, which led to a strong clash between him and Hitler. The shortest route between Berlin and Tokyo lay straight through Moscow. And on his return trip from Berlin, the Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs dropped briefly in Moscow. Here, on April 13th, 1941, he signed a pact of neutrality between the Soviet Union and Japan. Both countries pledged to maintain peaceful and friendly relations and mutually respect each other's territory, integrity, and independence. In the event that one of the sides becomes the victim of military action from one or several other nations, the other side of the pact would observe neutrality for the duration of the entire conflict. The neutrality pact between the USSR and Japan was a remarkable achievement for Stalin's diplomats and a crushing blow for Hitler's plans. Japan was Germany's ally, but it refused to fight against the Soviet Union. Moreover, Japan signed a pact with the Soviet Union instead. It's quite amazing when you realize this point of history that, right up until the dropping of the atomic bombs, Japan and the Soviet Union were still neutral with each other.
Yes.
Yes, it's Viktor Surikov. Yes, in chat there. But it shows the lack of real coordination between the supposed axis. And it also shows that Stalin was quite devious, because what he did was he was playing an asymmetric war with Japan, who didn't realize the degree of cooperation that the Allies would have. They thought they were fighting a war of nations and not a war of, essentially a global alliance. And they were really, again, quite naive throughout the entire war. They didn't really understand, I think, tactically how the world had changed during World War II. And the best thing for the Japanese to do would have not been to attack the Americans. It would have been to attack the Soviets in the East. It would have been to violate that agreement and to take the Soviet oil fields, to take Vladivostok. And they would be crushed. The Soviets would just be crushed because they couldn't fight a war on two fronts like that. They couldn't redeploy because of how big they'd be fighting the reality of how big Russia was, ironically. And it really shows that it's a singular war against Japan, a singular war against Germany, and a singular war against Italy. And it's a united front between the Western Allies, and it is, massive industrial support for the Soviet Union from America as well, with Lend-Lease. There was no equivalent of the Lend-Lease program from Germany to Japan. There was no equivalent of the Lend-Lease program from Germany to Italy. There was a lot of suspicion in both of those relationships.
It was more of a non-aggression pact and a mutual aid pact than actual allyship, as far as Japan and Germany were concerned. But yes, I mean, it's not like they were going to be fighting each other soon. But yes, no, Germany would have greatly benefited from Japan attacking the Russians. Tell you, you know what? I'm going to let you into a little bit of it's not a family secret as such. My great-grandfather was in Singapore when Singapore was taken by the Japanese. And he ended up in a prisoner of war camp held by the Japanese. In fact, he ended up helping build the railway through Burma. And, he made it out alive. In fact, I have a set of his medals. I might even post a picture of them in a minute, because I'm just looking at them at the moment, feeling slightly not nostalgic, because I never really knew the man, to be honest. Unfortunately, he died as I was born. But apparently he actually had a lot of respect, sort of, for the Japanese. They wouldn't let a Japanese product be in the household, apparently. But at the same time, always said that it was the Korean guards that were the real bastards. And that the Japanese had a code of honor that once you learned to understand, you could kind of respect it, but don't cross it because it would be the last thing you did. Which I've heard that before. It was literally a case of, oh, you've crossed us, and we told you not to do that. Well, we'll cut your head off as a not even a lesson. It's a warning to the others, to be honest.
Yes.
In fact, let me see if I can get this picture across, because you know what? When various people in my family just recently passed on, I've ended up I just inherited these medals, basically, and I'm still looking up what they all exactly mean. And it's quite a thing in many respects. Hold on a second, let me look at this. But yes, I have a lot of feels about the Japanese in the Second World War because of this. Because, well, you know, a member of my family actually got out alive, just actually on both sides, but that's another story. But yeah, apparently the Koreans were right bastards, because the Koreans were being used as guards in the prison camps and on the Burma Railway. Hang on, let me.
But while you're looking for that, the other one I want to talk about, again, we don't have a source for this because it's your point of historical fact, but the other incident that gets overlooked is the Winter War. People always talk about the asymmetrical, well, it wasn't even a victory. It was just a slowed advance by the Finns with the incompetence of the Red Army leadership. But the Winter War was a war of Soviet aggression, again. Yeah. It was another, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, and they invaded Poland, and they were allowed to do that because this wasn't a war about aggression. It wasn't a war about who was an aggressive nation. Finland was not an ally of the Nazis. Finland was not an aggressor nation in its own right. Stalin just decided he wanted more territory, and that was his real ambition with the Second World War, as we see with him being the main territorial benefactor from it.
You know what? I'm going to tell another family story here. My actual grandfather, the son of the person who earned these medals, actually was a member of the Finnish Air Force for that war. He wasn't allowed to be shipped out, but he signed up to be shipped out and was actually given the position in the Finnish Air Force to join that war. And the British Coal Board stopped him because he was a mining engineer, and they went, "No, you can't bugger off over to Finland to fight the Russians. You will stay here and dig coal." Yeah. So yeah, this is the Second World War has a lot of stuff for me. Unfortunately, it's a weird old one.
That's interesting. So I went to go help the Finns.
Yeah,
that's pretty base, to be fair, in the Second World War, especially with all the Uncle Joe propaganda that was going around.
Yes.
That we talked about during the Utilitarian special stuff.
I've told you a bit about my grandfather. My grandfather was remarkably based, actually. Yeah, I owe a lot to that man, including a very nice dagger that he brought back from Germany after the war. But anyway.
Well, the main thrust of the point is that once you examine it, the idea of the Axis as a united fighting force breaks down. And the idea of a war of democracies versus a war of aggressive dictatorships falls down once you remember whose side the Soviet Union is on. And you look at a lot of the measures taken against Japan prior to the Second World War. It becomes patently obvious that there is a huge amount of warmongering from both the Americans and the Soviets. I think one of the only nations that doesn't want war is Britain, but that's because it's so financially crippled and is a debtor nation. It certainly wants to bring more people into the war once it starts. But Britain with Clement Attlee and I hold in my hand a piece of paper and all that was very reticent to have a war because it was as we talked about in the interwar years, it has essentially lost its empire already. They were the real losers from the First World War when it comes to like territory. I know the Germans lost a lot of their Lebensraum, a lot of their Greater Germany stuff. But in terms of raw territory, the British were the ones really who lost the most influence over most of the world. The sun did set on the British Empire in the 1920s.
Oh, very much so. Very much so, sadly.
Again, it's a point of history, but it's a point of history that often gets forgotten. That there was an extreme amount of aggression, and I would recommend reading *The Chief Culprit* by Viktor Suvorov. It is a great kind of. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to fight off hiccups here, if you will excuse me. It's a great putting forward of the theory that Stalin was the real aggressor and architect behind the Second World War.
Yes, that's fair. That's not working. Oh well. Oh well. People have had a sideways view of it, of some of the medals anyway.
That looks fine. Yeah, sometimes they do that, bigger JPEGs for some reason.
But yeah, no, meritorious service and all sorts. That apparently I am allowed to wear, though I would feel extremely odd wearing them. I have to wear them on the right side instead of the left, and etc., and ask for permission to wear. Frankly, I didn't earn medals, and I'm not about to start wearing medals, even though I'm technically allowed to.
I can't verify a huge amount of the information in it without reading it, but there is also a book called Day of Deceit: The Truth About Pearl Harbor by a guy called Robert B. Stinnett, which I might link in the notes. It's an interesting read, and it goes into basically talks about Pearl Harbor like a lot of people talk about 9/11, in that they knew, and a lot of the people who knew may have welcomed it if they did know. But again, that's something I would need to do a lot more reading to verify, but I would recommend that, because there is a lot of ambiguity about whether Pearl Harbor was allowed to happen.
I had a look through that. It kind of confirms, but the thing is, I'm a big tinfoil hat wearer. I love my conspiracy theories. It kind of plays out right for me that they almost the fact that the aircraft carriers weren't in Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was hit makes me go a lot. It's probably unlikely that it was forced and a conspiracy to happen, but it did seem somewhat convenient that the two ships that were absolutely vital weren't there to be sunk when Pearl Harbor was struck.
Again, it's something that we may never know, but it certainly was an event that was welcomed by FDR and is in a circle in many ways.
It certainly played out well for everybody, yeah. I mean, it didn't play out well for any of the people on the ground, in the ships that were being attacked. But politically, yeah, it worked out kind of fortuitously. It did for.
Maniacal Foreigner mentioned the Codebreakers by David Kahn. That's another book. That wasn't on that list, but it's one I've been looking at and haven't had time to read in full because there's actually 15 books here. But again, that's worth a read if you want to do some reading around the subject. There's a lot of good stuff and a lot of contradicting information because of war secrets and all of that stuff. It really is the big takeaway from World War II and its events is the uncertainty surrounding them. We don't know a lot about what is supposedly historical fact in World War II. We don't know a lot of the angles of it, and a lot of the history there, again, as written, is a narrative. It is a story. It is essentially a work of fiction, the popular telling of World War II. It's a fiction that's reinforced by our history books, but it is still a fiction, and it's not like baby's first revisionism to talk about World War II. Especially in this sense, but when it comes to the libertarian historical narrative, I think that it's one of the areas that is best examined and has maybe made its way into the popular consciousness a bit more, because it's an area where so much of what we're told as historical fact is so blatantly propaganda that it starts to fall apart under its own weight, as we've talked about. And yes, the Hess files are still classified. But it's amazing how much stuff in World War II is still classified. And it's amazing how much stuff in World War II, just on the strength of its facts, falls apart. That's why there is so much examination of this, and that's why we're doing this in so many parts, is because World War II really, if you want the Rothbardian kind of narrative of history, is the smoking gun. It is the real kind of like hat tip. It is the real kind of, it tips their hand and says, look, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And now we can do it somewhat in the open after this point. That's what World War II is. And that's why World War II is so vital to this telling of history, because it is really, it's the pivotal event in creating the world kind of still as we know it.
And what we do have is the last empire, shall we say, monarchical empire in the East was about to fall and be destroyed and be turned into a democracy, wasn't it? Which seemed rather unfortunate for them, fortunate for the powers of democracy. Which
yes.
is interesting. I did notice we just got not a super chat,
we did get a donation there. HK9410 donated $20. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Hey guys, I'll have to watch this VOD later. I have shitty reception out here. Have pizza on me. Thank you very much. That's a very generous donation there.
That's
and we will have some pizza on you. But we do need to move on, Trigger. I've just realized how many topics we still have to cover. We can go over some of these a bit quicker, though.
Sure.
One of the big driving forces of transformation in World War II was the turbocharging of the concept of war economy. It had been trialed on a mass scale in World War I, but World War II, they really went ham with it. And they really went ham with the idea of state control of industry as a virtue, and state control of certain industries as natural during times of crisis. It's something you don't really think about, but this hadn't been the case before then. This hadn't been the case before the First World War, and it hadn't been done to this degree during the First World War. Yet now, when we think of wartime, we think of wartime government control of industry as natural. And many people take that for granted. But when you look at it separated from the historical propaganda, you begin to see how unusual it is, and how destructive it became to what was the shreds of the American Republic after the New Deal era. Indeed, many people praised what happened during the Second World War and its economic miracle, quotes unquote, for getting rid of some of the last stubbornness when it comes to, the measures of the New Deal. Mm-hmm. The war is seen as a necessary sacrifice in all of these aspects. You see that in the social aspects, the economic aspects, the international relation aspects. All of this is framed as World War II was bad, but look at all the good things we got out of it. It is really a mass act of human sacrifice when it comes to all these different aspects and all these different things that World War II is credited for, that you had to have tens of millions of people die to get these things. And you couldn't have got to where you got. And I will always stress this: you can't get to where we are now without the First World War, and you can't get to where we'll be at the end of this without the Second World War. You have to kill tens of millions of people to get mass liberal global democracy. That is what it's built on.
You're going to get me started about pink mist turning into green paper very soon. Yes. No, it's just very fucking sad that this is the reality of it. And yes, once again, beware military-industrial complex. But yeah, no, we again, the money people turned huge numbers of farm boys into smears all over foreign fields, and got rich in the process.
Well, there's a very famous speech by FDR, and we'll actually be looking at more of a mainstream source. We're looking at the National World War II Museum here. But there's a very famous speech by FDR called The Arsenal of Democracy, which again, it's wrapped in very patriotic language, but if you read it correctly, he's saying the quiet part loud. There's a whole thing. It says becoming the sorry, do you want to read this one, Trig? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Okay, becoming the arsenal of democracy. Early on in World War II, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, one of Adolf Hitler's top lieutenants, said that the Americans could only make refrigerators and razor blades. Well, they would never be able to produce the military equipment and supplies necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. Hitler took the same view in his public speeches, but privately he knew the clock was ticking. Germany would have to achieve victory first, before American production had time to ramp up. Early on in ramp up. Hitler was right. The Great Depression had slowed down many American industries, but they were far from dead. Even in 1938, when the European War had yet to begin, the United States was dealing with an economic recession. The national income in America was nearly double the national incomes of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Americans also produced more steel than Germany that year and mined almost double the amount of coal. Even the depressed economy played a role in making the United States a potentially formidable foe. With so many factories offline, there was a large reserve of industrial equipment and unemployed citizens available for immediate work. By May 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had decided it was time to activate his sleeping giant. France was collapsing, and Great Britain stood virtually alone against the Axis powers in Europe. Bravely alone. Alone, but resolute. I'm adding that bit because, flag waving. The United States was not in war yet, and the public wanted to keep it that way. Still, Roosevelt realized that America had to be prepared to defend itself, and he hoped he would be able to offer the Allies some kind of assistance. He urged Congress to increase military funding from $24 million to a mere $700 million.
Yeah.
Little step up in funding there. In his annual budget message on January the 5th, 1942, remember, that's 1940s millions as well. I mean, back when $1 million was a lot of money. Roosevelt said, "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year."
Well, if you look at Lend-Lease, what happened was that the Americans had entered the war before Pearl Harbor. They had economically entered the war before Pearl Harbor. They were really, and contrary to a lot of their agreements, were supplying a huge amount of equipment to the Allies, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And they only really entered the war as well when it became clear that Britain and France couldn't rack up any more debt with them, just like in World War One. It's a direct repeat of their entry into World War One, in which the public doesn't want to go, and then are eventually cajoled into it with a series of slightly, possibly contrived instances. We don't really have proof for that, and it's a direct repeat of it. And what happens here is that you end up with, again, this is saying it in glowing terms, but Hitler was kind of right. The American economy wasn't geared towards making weapons because there wasn't market demand for it. The American public didn't want war, and the creation of a war economy had to be top-down, and crucially, it had to be done against the express wishes of the American people. The American people didn't want war economy. They didn't want to become the arsenal of democracy. But Roosevelt decided they would be, and in doing so, he adopted Hitler's model of economics.
Well, yeah, America largely was still, the people, was still Monroe Doctrine yay. And
yes.
I kind of wish they bloody well were. In general. Not that I wanted England to fall to the Germans, but yeah. Roosevelt was not of that opinion.
No, his inner circle especially were baying for war at this point.
Yeah.
But the war economy in America started long before America entered the war. And it was only able to be turned into one because of how much influence Roosevelt had built up and because of the events of the New Deal. This is not possible without the shattering of the Republic by Woodrow Wilson and then kind of the destruction of the pieces by FDR. He would not have the power to do this, and he would not have the support to do this in terms of the middle managers and the elites, really, unless he had done what he did. He did not have the American people behind him at this point. He did not. That only came later, and that only came begrudgingly with Pearl Harbor, where they could frame it as a defensive rather than an aggressive war. But yet America pivots itself to become a war economy. And it does so in direct emulation of fascist Keynesianism.
Yeah.
Essentially, what they do is they take the bait and they say, right, if you don't think we can make weapons, we're going to make other weapons. But if America is a free market economy, then what they are doing is they are throwing that aside to pursue a war. And you can say that's a good thing, and you can say, well, they need to do that to defeat Hitler, but that's still the fact of the matter. And again, you have to frame this as an existential war between good and evil that is that is imposed upon the United States, and that is wholly virtuous for this to be justifiable. You really have to buy into the propaganda to agree with the fact that the US was turned into a war economy when the people didn't want war.
Well, this is why I bang on about Pearl Harbor being almost an inside job. Is that Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, not only drew the Americans into a war in the Pacific, but it also drew them into a war in Europe. Once they were at war, it was very easy for them to be at war against Hitler as well. And that suited FDR no end. It did not suit the American people. There's a telling of history where England and England and Germany sign a peace treaty and decide not to go to war after France had been taken, and maybe things, if America hadn't gotten into the war, maybe things might have worked out okay-ish. But yeah. The Pearl Harbor being attacked was kind of, as I said, that's why I think it's largely debunked. I think it's largely fake news, essentially, but it does seem iffy about Pearl Harbor.
If it wasn't Pearl Harbor, it would have been something else. The point is that FDR wanted to take America into World War II, and he would have done it by hook or by crook.
Yes. He just got lucky.
No, it's not that he got lucky. It's that eventually the pressure on Japan and the pressure on Germany through Lend-Lease and through the economic sanctions would have caused a response. Otherwise, they would have just lost. It's not the inevitability of war. World War II is something that is constructed, and FDR wants World War II. Hitler wants World War II. Stalin wants World War II. They all want war for their own reasons. But all those reasons come from the fact that all these countries have become total states. They have become these, crisis-hungry, as it were, total leviathans, and that they need something like the Second World War just to keep the show going. Just like now we need something like the COVID lockdowns just to keep the show going. It's the same fact. And they essentially don't care about the mass death. All they see is the glory and economic benefits, really, of war. And those are told to you in retrospect glowingly. But again, it's a reading of history that tips the hand that this is why they did it. These are the incentives. It's like, well, why would someone want the Second World War? Look at the results. And again, we'll go through the who benefits analysis next time because it's such a big one. But the idea of war as a cure-all for economic ills is something, again, to be very suspicious of, because even if they're right about that, even if they're right about the fact that the Second World War cured the Depression, which there is a strong case for the fact that it didn't, and it caused mass, misallocation of resources throughout the time period, as we went through somewhat last time. But if you think the only way to cure an economy is to kill millions of people, then maybe you don't have the best ideology. But
no, maybe we don't. Maybe I'm getting annoyed. Maybe I've had too many beers and vodkas. I'm getting very ranty and angry about fucking globalists at the moment. I feel an unexchanged rant coming on. We should probably we should probably move on a little quickly before I start going on about the fucking globalists and the goddamn money people behind FDR and how they were so keen to create a war. England didn't want a war at this point in time. France certainly didn't want a war at this time. Italy didn't want a war at this time. Italy was set on becoming having an economic boom and happily sort of reversing the fortunes they'd had for the last 100 years. Spain was the same. Everyone was about to go, things are looking good for a time, and then Hitler went and fucked it all up. Stalin fucked it all up, and FDR and the German... Fox, I broke the conditioning a long time ago.
Yes.
Now it's your job. The writing is all there on the wall. Just read it. Just read it. Oh dear.
Well, there's an interesting... I'm not going to read from it too heavily. There's an interesting, very early Rothbard writing, actually, from 1950. One of the earliest Rothbard writings we have, basically about the fact that he doesn't talk about the ethics of the war, but he does talk about the fact that not utilizing the free market, in a time of war, would be inefficient. And I would go a step further than what he said here is okay. I quite like it. It's more of a pure economics argument. But what it's underpinned by is, if people really wanted war and it was a war for survival, they would participate enthusiastically in the war economy, and they wouldn't need all these labor controls. They wouldn't need to be labor drafting. Why do you need labor drafting? And why do you need to force a country to pivot to a war economy if its citizens are the ones who think that you need war? It's a really, does the free market of a country demand war? And in the case of the US in 1940, it categorically did not. And so you have to have forced conversion to war economies. Again, it's quite funny to talk about, but yes, the free market can provide for war if there needs to be war, but it must be within the interests of the people within that country via the market to engage in a war economy. One must follow the other. The desire for war must be as universal as possible. And, the majority of businesses must want to promote a war effort and must want to fight a war. And if they don't, why is a country engaged in the war in the first place? If it isn't coming from the market, i.e. the interactions of the people, where is it coming from? And in the US example, we see it's coming from the strata of elites. Yeah. It's coming from, the newly minted managerialists who essentially have power now beyond that of kings in many ways. They don't have to raise armies from the people. They don't have to go to their feudal lords. They just decide that they snap their fingers and they decide the economy now just makes guns.
Yep. And this is the point. This is it. This is the point where America becomes the world's biggest trader in arms. This is the point where America quietly, whilst being an economic powerhouse for the last 50, 70 years, whatever, we're great at this, we're great at that. America is great at selling warfare. They sell the biggest, the best, and the most expensive weapons. They employ people to build the biggest, the most expensive weapons. And when they leave like we're seeing in Afghanistan right now, when they leave a field of battle, they just throw the weapons that they've been using, like they did in Vietnam, into the fucking lake, into the fucking river, into the sea. In Afghanistan, they just leave them there for the enemy to pick up because it's cheaper for them to make more weapons, employ people to make more weapons that they can then tax and create those weapons and buy them all over again, tax people on the earnings that they make creating those weapons, tax them on the sale of those weapons back into the US military, than it is to pick the weapons up and put them on a plane.
The thing is, you're right. Within a public war economy framework, within a state-sponsored war economy model, as we still have in many aspects in the United States, but you have the left who rants about the military-industrial complex, but essentially those are semi-nationalized interests. That's like a socialist self-own.
I'm right, and I can rant about the military-industrial complex. Fuck those guys.
Well, the military-industrial complex is a top-down institution that is socialistic in nature. I keep telling this to people. It's essentially a massive substitute to the U.S. economy. And what World War I and World War II hide is it doesn't matter who's using the guns. It doesn't matter if the war is won or lost, as long as it's not being fought on American soil. All that matters is the guns are being made and sold. All that matters is the economic activities happening to them. The actual events of the war and foreign policy, if you look at it in a purely economic sense, in a purely, does this benefit the semi-nationalized arms industry? That doesn't matter. The war itself doesn't matter. All that matters is that they sell the most amount of guns to people. Yes. And the First and Second World War is a semi-engineered situation to do just that. They really have no skin in the game. They don't really care if Europe ends up as a barren wreck. It might affect their trade a bit, but they might have got, so filthy rich in the meantime, that doesn't matter. What matters is the war economy and the profit from it.
Yeah, you've seen Lord of War, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah, just checking. Because that bit at the end, where he starts there, he's been arrested, and he's there going, in a minute, you're going to get a phone call. Because your government, your bosses need people like me. After he's been selling, you need people like me to sell the weapons that you create, that this country creates, and you need people like me to sell those weapons without you getting your hands dirty. And this is it exactly. England is as bad, and France is as bad. Germany isn't quite as bad, but basically the Western part, we are warmongers. We sell weapons to the world. It is our primary, and yes, it is a great movie. Yes, it is our primary industry these days. Always has been for the last 50 to 60 years. I'm sorry I cut you off.
Oh no, it's fine. What I was going to say is, it's the fact of the matter is that when you talk about limiting war profiteering, when you talk about taxes and the state stepping in to decide who should and shouldn't benefit from the war, what they're saying is that the main benefactor of the war should be the state. Mm-hmm. That is de facto what they are saying when they impose price controls and taxes, and they take money out of the economy to stop people, quote unquote, profiteering. It really shows that the main benefactors of a war economy are the people who are in charge of the economy. And the people who are in charge of the economy in a post-New Deal state are the newly emerged managerialists. That is the fact, that this is a massive profiteering escapade for them. And that they are, this makes them the newly minted kings of the world and brings about the 1950s and the early 60s. And a lot of the post-war prosperity is built on the back of all this debt. And as that fades and as things start to get out of control again, as we'll see later on, that, it really just belays the fact the American economy itself doesn't thrive and doesn't survive without these horrendous events taking place. You can't have the prosperity of the 50s without the mass death of the 40s. One does not follow without the other. And again, it's a point I keep making, which is a point I will keep making. Anyway, I'm sorry, Trig. We may have to move on to the next point.
Okay.
Because there's someone we haven't talked about for a little bit who is very important in this time period.
Oh, absolutely. You know what? If I wanted to out my, you've seen it. You've seen the picture of that our friend did of me sat next to Churchill.
Yes.
I'm not going to dig it up. It's a great meme, but that would mean giving away my face online, which, you know what? One of these days, maybe soon.
Trig, there's a digitized version of your face right now.
Yes, I know there's a digitized version of my face right now, and yes, I do look like that, but yeah, anyway.
I know what you mean, though.
Yeah.
I'm being very clever here and putting Winston Churchill as the £5 note, because it literally has the central bank next to him, which has a huge amount of subtext there in this stream. But Churchill is really the man who lobbied America to join the war both times. If FDR and Woodrow Wilson are the push, he is the pull. In both wars, well, to be fair, there was Lloyd George as well, but in both wars, he spans that period. He is, in Europe, really, in many ways, when war happens, he becomes escalator-in-chief. I won't call him warmonger-in-chief, because Britain won the war in 1914, it didn't won one in 1939. It really did not. But once war happens, he's essentially trying to run to the big boys, and the big boy in both cases is America.
It's been really difficult rethinking Winston Churchill because I grew up listening to his speeches. In some ways, I'm not going to say idolized Winston Churchill, but he was definitely the great wartime prime minister that held the country together in his darkest hour. And I'll tell you what, even now, that man knew rhetoric. That man knew how to give a bloody good speech.
Well, so to be fair, so did Hitler.
There is nothing wrong with being a good orator. There are many problems with being a good orator and an arsehole with it. But, yes, he was a very, very... He had a good turn of phrase. And even now, he still holds a fond place in my heart, even though I know he was a shitbag. I know he cost so many lives at Gallipoli and so many lives elsewhere. But, when you hear phrases like, nothing is so exhilarating as to be shot out without, result, when he was in the Boer War and people were bouncing bullets around him, and he's like, crikey, this is exhilarating, isn't it? Let's shoot a few more of these Boers. There's something endearing about that, even if he was a complete psychopath.
I considered having a bit more Hitchens in this episode, but Hitchens gets within a fucking ball hair of it and decides to veer off in the other direction sometimes. Because Hitchens is, for better or worse, he is the consummate public school boy. He is
as am I.
As a you, but he is the consummate, he's establishment right who really knows what's going on, but he's not willing to commit, as someone like Ralph Raico is, who ends up quoting him here, to really debunking the myth of history. There is a lot of revisionism that takes place with Winston Churchill, but it is left revisionism, and it tends to focus on his racism and his role in the empire, rather than his role in fomenting and prolonging the two world wars. He's seen as a hero for that, and a hero for his, being the architect, as it puts here, of the welfare state.
But enough of his good points, yes. Yes.
I was going to say, it's quite funny. Yeah, enough of his good points. Winston Churchill helped create he helped create the welfare state. He helped us win war. He helped fight World War I and II. But he was a racist, and he supported the empire. Therefore, he's bad. And that is the revisionism that we hear about Churchill. We don't hear this. We don't hear the wreath. There's a quote, again, it's further up in there, but Ralph Raico in Great Wars of Great Leaders, in his section about rethinking Churchill, he says, Churchill was, as Hitchens writes, the human bridge across which the transition was made between a non-interventionalist and a globalist America. And in many ways it is. Like I said, he was really the pulling force in breaking America out of its so-called isolationism. He was really the devil on their shoulder when it came to the fact that they should interfere in the world. Because the fact was, Britain was no longer an empire. It was no longer a superpower, and it needed the Americans behind it to be able to project force and achieve its goals. And Churchill was willing to essentially sell out Britain to the Federal Reserve in order to win. That is the real fact of it. But I think it's page 55, page 72 in the PDF, if you're reading along in the notes. Again, I will post these notes. I'm sorry I've been a bit lax with that. But what I want to talk about really is Churchill's opportunism. Here it is. It's the part marked opportunism and rhetoric. Yet before 1940, the word most closely associated with Churchill was opportunist. He had twice changed his party affiliation from the Conservative to Liberal and then back again. His move to the Liberals was allegedly an issue of free trade, but in 1930 he sold out on free trade, as well even tariffs on food, and proclaimed that he had cast off Cobdenism forever. That's as head of the Board of Trade before World War I, he opposed increased armaments. But when he became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, he pushed for bigger and bigger budgets, spreading wild rumors of the growing strength of the German Navy, just as he did in the 1930s about building up the German Air Force. He attacked socialism before World War One. Even during the war, he promoted war. During the war, he promoted war socialism, calling for the nationalization of railroads, and declaring in a speech, "Our whole nation must be organized, must be socialized, if you like the word." Churchill's opportunism continued to the end. In the 1945 election, he briefly latched onto Hayek's road to serfdom and tried to paint the Labour Party as totalitarian, while it was Churchill himself who, in 1943, had accepted the Beveridge plans for the post-war welfare state and the Keynesian management of the economy. And we'll get to that in more detail next time. Throughout his career, the one guiding rule was to climb to power and stay there, which has really been the guiding rule of the Conservative Party as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
There were two principles that were for a long time deemed dear to Churchill's heart. One was anti-communism. He was an early and fervent opponent of Bolshevism. For years, he very correctly decried the bloody baboons and foul murders of Moscow. His deep early admiration for Benito Mussolini was rooted in his shrewd appreciation of what Mussolini had accomplished. In an Italy teetering on the brink of Leninist revolution, El Duce had discovered the one formula that could counteract the Leninist appeal: hyper-nationalism with a social slant. Churchill lauded fascismo's triumphant struggle against the bestial appetites and passions of Leninism, claiming that it proved the necessary antidote to the communist poison. And yet, when the time came, when Churchill made his peace with communism, when the time came, Churchill made his peace with communism. In 1941, he gave unconditional support to Stalin, welcomed him as an ally, embraced him as a friend. Churchill went as far as Roosevelt and used the affectionate nickname Uncle Joe. As late as the Potsdam Conference, he repeatedly announced of Stalin, "I like that man."
Jesus. You know what? I'm going to say it again. Churchill had a nice turn of phrase. He very well used the English language to its best capabilities, and that's always endearing. And maybe I said this last time. I do think that the poor old Mussolini did get the one of the shittier ends of the stick during the 1930s and 1940s. I mean,
Mussolini was much smarter than Hitler, and he's the guy who really decided to, he bridged the ends of the horseshoe, and he combined extreme nationalism with extreme socialism to create this kind of what we now call almost like it's like a unity appeal. Really, it's one of the only things in the 1930s that became highly fashionable. Was the idea of a totalitarian state that was both nationalistic and socialistic. Fascism was in fashion at the time.
Yeah, I have the feeling that if he were alive today, Angela Merkel would love him. But I think he got a bad deal. I'm far too authoritarian for me. But at the time, I think he was forced into the situation that he got himself into, and as a result, Italy got screwed over. He would have been far better going the way of Spain, and might have, lived a long and happy life if he had. But
Churchill is a great example of essentially a con man in politics.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. Much like Boris.
Yes, he is. He's someone who is a pure pragmatist, and his pragmatic goal is to retain and gain power.
Yes.
He's a great example of why you need an ethic and why you need a set of principles that you live by, and you need to be consistent with them. Otherwise, you end up, as he did, flip-flopping on so many issues when they became more or less popular or more or less likely to gain him power. The fact of the matter is, he was unprincipled and in many cases amoral.
He's like Clarkson's Jaguar driver. He's the guy that turns up for a meal and has forgotten his wallet, but is so bloody likable that you end up inviting him to the restaurant next time anyway. Because he's got a nice turn of phrase, he's witty, he's funny, but you know what? The guy's a shitbag. And he's never going to bring his wallet, but he drives a nice car, and he always seems to have a nice girlfriend. It's always different every single time, mind you. And when you look into it further, there's a a long string of teary-eyed girls with, unwanted pregnancies behind him. The guy's an asshole. But somehow... Yeah.
The thing is, I think Churchill is remembered in the same way that Hitler would be remembered if he'd won the war.
I think Churchill was more fun, more caddish, if you will, than Hitler. Hitler actually had principles. Churchill, I don't really think he did. He just sort of went, "Oh, that's popular at the moment. Let's find an angle that I can make money on that."
He's the poster boy for this kind of collective spirit.
Yeah.
For this, in a sense, kind of subsummation of yourself to the nation. It's not nationalistic is the thing. It is purely collectivist. It's this feeling of being part of the national and global community. It's this almost like mutated nationalism that people draw on, like when they draw on the spirit of the Blitz for the NHS, like when they draw on, when Boris Johnson draws on Winston Churchill. They use this same trick in saying that allowing yourself to become a tool of the elites is a wonderful thing, and that you're doing your part to face off this great enemy, and it really is just it always was a lie. That's the thing. We see it not just being bastardized, but being used in the exact same way. That Winston Churchill was someone whose premiership is mirrored by a lot of the war measures that were brought in place in the UK at the time. Again, we don't have time to cover these in full, but all those railings that you see missing, they weren't used to build Spitfires. They were piled up. They went on a scrap heap and weren't used. It just made people feel good to give people scrap, to give the government scrap iron. It didn't have the metallurgy to turn into aircraft fuselage. It didn't have the metallurgy to turn into gun barrels. It had completely the wrong minerals in it. It was pig iron. You couldn't turn that into good steel. It would take as much resources as using iron ore. Yeah. But people were just led to believe they were helping out. It's the same thing with the anti-aircraft fire in London. They were just They were blind firing shells. They didn't hit shit, but it just made people feel better. And that really is the way that Churchill pursued the war. It was a feel-good premiership.
You know what?
That was threadbare.
You know what, though? It worked. That wartime spirit, that Blitz spirit, carried him and served him very, very well. And served the nation very well.
It didn't serve. The thing is, it served those in charge of the nation. In the end, it ruined the nation. It bankrupted the nation.
At the time, though, it did draw the country together, giving people a reason to. We were all fighting together. Another one. I'm going to tell another story about my grandfather. Literally, I told you he went off to. He tried to go over to Finland. Wasn't allowed to by the British Coal Board. Instead, he was working at a coal mine in Stoke-on-Trent, and he spent his time helping the mine there. He was degreasing American guns, as American soldiers were brought over during the getting ready for D-Day. He was literally sort of going, right, okay, I've got a high-pressure steam hose. I will help you degrease your guns that have just been brought over so they're ready for action. He was also, getting the local lads together and camouflaging lakes. And actively the whole community, all the lads in Stoke-on-Trent were all getting together and doing their bit, going out and doing anything they could to, fool, Hitler's Luftwaffe, stop the bombers from reaching, Manchester, which, to be honest, they probably wouldn't have been able to reach and get back from anyway. But nonetheless, there was a wartime spirit that brought England together. England was very definitely very strong during the war. Because we were giving and war fighting to people were literally, as you say, ripping up iron railings to go and make Spitfire engines that weren't being done.
The problem is that was done in the pursuit of what essentially was a lie. That was done so that at the end of the war and towards the end of the war, things like the World Bank could be set up.
Yes, I know.
It makes it worse because there were all these individual acts of heroism and all this great spirit, and it was used to pursue this war for profit and social change, this act of social engineering.
Yeah, I know.
And it makes all that have almost like a bitter taste to it, because all these people did all these great things, and they did, and Winston Churchill did keep up the nation's spirit. But at the end of it, and as we'll see, Britain was once again a diminished nation that truly did lose all of its empire by the end of it. Almost all of it.
Well, let's not forget.
By the 1960s.
Also, we've got every single landed lord, giving up their stately homes to military sort of operations. Suddenly, Castle Donington, where the racetrack is, was given over to the Ministry of Defence and used as a staging ground for military equipment, etc., etc. And Donington Hall, which was a beautiful hall full of, lavish gold and golden silver candlesticks and big mirrors, etc., etc., handed over to the MOD for use during the Second World War. And at the end of the Second World War, actually it was more like around about the 60s, it was given back to the owners. The land was covered in oil, bits of scrap metal everywhere, and every single bit of gold and silver and mirror and every single piece of finery that was in the hall, the great, beautiful, massive building that was there, stripped. Stolen by the state. Donated by the Lord, stolen by the state. And they gave him back his land, and it was useless. The only thing he could do with it was create Castle Donington Racetrack, which is actually a damn good racetrack, and I have been around it many times. But nonetheless, that was a beautiful piece of land, destroyed by the state, who gave no toss whatsoever for the donation of it by the Lord. And once again, this happened all over England. Stately homes, like in the First World War, destroyed by the state, robbed and stolen from by the state for, as you say, the pursuit of fucking globalist parliamentarian power.
Well, it's a tragedy, because all these things were used, again, it was used as a justification. And once you start to deprogram the idea of the existential war of good and evil, and you start to realize that a lot of this was purely self-interested, then all of these things do become tragedies. They don't become these necessary sacrifices.
Well, they do not care about your property rights. They take property and they just, mine now.
One of the most corrosive things about war collectivism is the collectivization of peoples. And again, this is something I don't really want to use sources for, because it's a bit of a big discussion. We'll be using some more source-based stuff about it next time. But there's the issue really of what I would call selective dehumanization. In that, when you look at the supposed aggression nations, what happened in World War I and the punishment of the German people is exactly what happens in World War II. But we don't count that as a tragedy. We count that as, there's the whole denazification thing, there's the partitioning of Germany, there's the occupation of Japan, which really continued right up until the 2000s, if you look at what was in Okinawa. The picture I used there is an atrocity that happened during the Winter War. The Russians would send partisans into Finnish villages to basically terrorize them. And a war journalist caught an image of just 2 dead Finnish children in a field. And it's one of the forgotten war crimes of the Second World War, that the Soviet state, once it couldn't achieve its aims militarily, attempted to terrorize the Finnish people, and did so in a very brutal fashion. And this, again, was part of the alliance. This is part of the Allies. And all of this is wrapped up in the idea that it was for the greater good. There's a couple of other things that end up like this. We'll talk about the nuclear. The nuclear question.
They are very fond of pictures of dead children, aren't they? They really enjoy that imagery that it is so abhorrent to the human eye to see dead children. And they go, oh, lovely, let's use that. They are the most fucking vile example of humanity for doing that.
The thing is, that's just an event that happened in Finland. The Soviets did that. This is what happened.
But to utilize that, to use that for anyone that uses that imagery for their own political gain is.
Well, the thing is, it was done on one side, but not on the other. It's dead British children and dead dead Jewish children, yes, but dead Finnish children forgotten by history. The issue is that this happened everywhere, and it was a almost universal tragedy on every front. The Second World War, it shouldn't have happened. That's the whole thing. That to pursue this war and to lengthen this war, as Churchill did, he did lengthen the war, is abhorrent. And really, the selective dehumanization of people is one of the biggest aspects of this. When you talk about the way the Japanese and the Germans are disregarded, it's a real historical faux pas to talk about what happened to the German people and what happened to the Japanese people, because they are seen, they have to be seen as history as deserving it. That is the subtext in all World War II historiography, that to some degree the German people deserve what happened to them because they tolerated Hitler. And when you apply that universally, it's one of the real corrosive aspects of democracy. That what happens is that once you start to be seen as giving permission for your ruler to do these terrible things that they're doing, you then become culpable to it. It's the same reason we, excuse Bomber Harris and the British, what they refer to as the classic case of overbombing when they talk about Dresden. But that was swept under the rug historically because the German people were seen as backing Hitler. They deserved it because they voted for Hitler. And it's the same logic that, suicide bombers use in the UK because, the British people voted for Tony Blair, and Tony Blair decided to bomb Iraq and Afghanistan and kill thousands of innocent people. But if you believe that the Japanese people and the German people were legitimate targets during the Second World War, you must also believe that British civilians are legitimate targets for Iraqi people. If you're at war, if there is an aggressive war going on, that's exactly the same logic that is being pursued there. And it's not something I think people would be comfortable with if the Allies were held accountable for how many civilian deaths they were responsible for. They then become the biggest perpetrators of war crimes during the Second World War because of what happened in Japan and Germany and the amount of death that took place there.
Well, if we're going to start talking about Dresden and the dams, there's something to be said there. But total war is total war.
Well, it is, but the thing is, as we talked about during World War I, total war is only ever possible between total states.
Yes.
And that this entire tragedy is brought about, and the selective dehumanization is brought about by the psychology of democracy and by the psychology of total states. You can't have this selective, you wouldn't talk about punishing the serfs, the peasants of a tyrannical king. In a historical context, in the 17th century, you wouldn't go and kill the peasantry of a mad king who was pursuing a war. You would see them as victim.
Yeah.
And the psychology when it comes to liberal democracies is different. You see the body of people who vote for the leader as responsible for their actions. And that cuts both ways. We see ourselves as collectively responsible for the good things government does. But those against us see us as collectively responsible for the bad thing government does. It's one of my arguments about why people shouldn't vote. Because voting, whether you like it or not, tacitly gives permission for those people to do things in your name. If you believe they are your representatives, and you believe that literally, then what they do represents you. And to a degree, you are. That's why I don't vote. That's why I haven't voted for years. Because it's a mental trap, and it is a literal trap that you can't trust those people unless you believe those people are actual paragons of virtue. You shouldn't vote because you are responsible for it if you do.
I know you say that. I'm still not quite there on that front because I know that if I don't vote for who I think is in some way the lesser of the two evils, the worst case scenario might be.
Well, it's the mutually assured destruction. It's the utilitarianism. Yeah. It's I'm going to allow the lesser of two evils rather than saying how about we don't have evils.
There is a part of me that also says that if you don't vote, if I don't vote for either Boris or Corbyn, how do I feel that I have a right to moan about either one afterwards?
Well,
You know,
you can moan about the entire process, and you can moan about the entire strata of elite society. That is the mental trap of democracy. It pits you against your fellow man.
Yes.
It says, I should vote, so the man next to I'm going to screw you over with my vote, so you don't screw me over with your vote. That is the real trap of democracy, that it pits people against each other, and it makes people see the actions of others in in a quote unquote civic society as somehow both competitive and hostile.
I mean, I don't know whether my vote counts. I don't know whether the votes that we put into Magic Box as we do our religious duty towards the state every 4 years even are counted. There is an act of faith going off there.
Yeah, the problem that you have in both cases is that the civics angle and the Winston Churchill as a hero angle is so ingrained into the British people that it's very difficult for them to think outside of it.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is that there are other methods. And actually, to answer what Maniacal Foreigners said there, you don't have the power to change the system. Actually, that's where you're wrong. Everybody does. There is a certain amount of testicular fortitude involved in it, and how would you want to go down in history? Because look up 1605 November the 5th in England. One man did fucking have a good go at changing the whole system in one fell swoop.
That is the logic, though. That is the logic that keeps the system going. It's, I can't change the system, therefore I will vote for, a representative of the system. That's what the whole democracy process keeps people trapped in.
Yes.
It keeps people trapped in this limited idea of what they can have. And it's choice as defined by the system.
Yes, and this is where Fukuyama starts to kick in, and I really need to get round to finishing that book, but he annoys the living crap out of me because Fukuyama's end of history principle does my head in. But yes, it would be an interesting world where you came to a general election and they went, well, the whole country hasn't voted. Don't know what to do now. That would be a very, very, very interesting world, but
there's a great undertone. I was reading an article today about it, actually, from USA Today, about the sin of the rejection of democracy. That the American people are sick, and their sickness is the rejection of the civic process.
Yes,
and that you are a bad citizen if you don't vote. That is drilled into you, and that is such a psychological trap for people, and it is such a it's such a ridiculous statement, really. You're a bad person if you do not partake in the system, and that really is, it again tips the hand of how really you are forced to participate in it. If you don't want to participate in the system at all, that you don't deserve to belong in society. They have the idea that rights are reciprocal, but rights aren't reciprocal for you. It only goes one way. You have to reciprocate to receive rights, but you can't ask for reciprocal, response that way. It really is part of the trap of quote unquote civics. But I think we're getting a little bit off track there.
Yeah.
It's part of why people were able to ignore Soviet war crimes, because their victory against Hitler was for the greater good. Therefore, all actions in pursuit of the victory can be forgiven. It is the end point of utilitarian thinking. You can justify World War II as the most good for the most people because the bad guys lost and the good guys won, and it doesn't matter what cost that took and what crimes were committed in pursuit of that goal. What matters is that Hitler lost and FDR won. What matters is that the Japanese were defeated and Pearl Harbor was avenged, and that this idea of subjective morality as kind of objective good is where you end up with the worst excesses of the utilitarian thinking. And that really is exemplified by something like World War II. The other angle here we really have to talk about when we get towards the end of the war is unconditional surrender.
Yes.
Because this marks a huge difference than the First World War. Within the First World War, sure, the peace imposed on them wasn't ideal, and they were treated like they had surrendered. But at the very least, Germany was allowed the opportunity to. Yeah, morality is subjective. Yeah, that's sorry, I'm kind of Mark for talking in the chat there, but yeah, that is my whole point. That really utilitarianism presupposes that your morality is able to discern what is and isn't good for other people. You end up with essentially communism. That's where it really comes from. But the idea of unconditional surrender was not a part of Versailles. Germany in 1918 did not. They signed an armistice. They signed a later surrender when they were strong-armed into it a bit more. But there was no invasion of Germany. There was no race to Berlin in the First World War. And the Second World War really was a lesson in the fact that the Allies wanted to cause as much annihilation as possible. Again, but we'll get onto the elephant in the room after this, which I think is one of the most telling events in the war, which is the dropping of the 2 nuclear bombs. But unconditional surrender as a goal, and the idea that negotiating with Italy, with Germany, and with Japan was verboten, that they couldn't do that. And it's the same logic that governs the Taliban, as we've seen now. They saw negotiating with the Taliban as evil, and that's where this logic comes from. That if you're fighting an enemy that is quote unquote evil, that there cannot be anything but unconditional surrender. That you must pursue the war to its seen as logical conclusion, and that is the conclusion that essentially has the most death and destruction, but also allows you to build, sell, and utilize the most arms. Just coincidentally.
Yes. Also, unconditional surrender was new to the First and Second World Wars. This idea of you give up and you are mine now, bitch, was fairly new. Normally, surrender was okay. We've lost this battle. Let's call it a day here, chaps, and we'll come to the treaty table, and come to some sort of we'll redraw the maps a little bit and work it out. This unconditional surrender is hand in hand with total war.
Yes.
It cannot be. You cannot have total unconditional surrender without total war, and this has only been a thing for the last 100 years. This has never happened prior to the last 100 years.
The thing is, when conflicts were pursued in the way that the Second and First World Wars were pursued in antiquity, they were seen as massacres and butchers, and the people who pursued them were seen as tyrants. Universally, when you get a population that is terrorized by an invading force, it is seen as against the rules. It's very unusual. There's the whole thing about Jerusalem during the Crusades and what was done there, and that was seen as, it was picked out because it was so unusual then. Wars in the past were fought generally between lords. They were generally fought with mercenaries and professional soldiers, and they were fought on a small scale to achieve a limited means. And each man would allow his enemy some degree of dignity because he knew that at some point he was going to lose a battle himself. Yeah. That is how war in Europe existed. And yes, there was more of it at certain times, especially during the religious wars, but it was not a war. It wasn't a war of population against population. It wasn't a war of society against society. It wasn't a war of total state against total state. And, unconditional surrender is a result of total war, which is a result of total states. And the evils therein and the loss of life therein isn't possible without first setting up a managed economy. I know it's kind of unusual to say, but you don't get nuclear weapons and nuclear war, as we'll get onto, without the Federal Reserve and Keynesianism. You don't have there is no market demand for nuclear weapons. We laugh about McNukes and all that, but nuclear weapons are the only thing that has only ever been owned by states.
Yeah,
which is very telling. There has never been private ownership of nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons are a product of modern states.
Not that we know of. But yes, no. I mean, it's like Bob and Mildred Miggins of Mrs. Miggins' Pie Shop in the 16th century never gave a toss about what was going off in what war was going off between whom. It didn't bother them that they carried on making pies in Bristol or London or wherever their pie shop was, day in, day out, regardless, and so on. It really wasn't a bother to them because they were employed, they were making their pies, and so on. The average Joe and average Josephine weren't involved in the machinations of the states, but come last century, suddenly planes are flying overhead and dropping bombs straight into the city, and Mrs. Miggins' pie shop is no more, even though Mrs. Miggins has absolutely got nothing to do and didn't really feel either way about who this Adolf Hitler was either way. But nonetheless.
Again, in past wars, that was seen as completely outside of the rules of conflict. And it is in modern war as well. But when states fight states, they always excuse their own targeting of civilians, just like what happens in the Middle East with the US and the UK today. I often make jokes about Obama's drone striking of Yemeni weddings, but that is a thing that happened. Yeah. I mean, the man quite literally ordered the death of children. So did Bush, and possibly also so did Trump in some cases. Although he was very, very anti that. He was one of the only people who actually tried to stop the forever wars sincerely. But every time when you get a country that pursues war as a state project, they always excuse the targeting of civilians, because in a war between modern democratic liberal states, you see them as a monolith. You see the state and the people as the same thing, and that is an extremely destructive mode of thought. But it is only one that has existed, you're right, within the last 100 years.
Massively destructive. Terrible way of looking at things.
And you put the Sun Tzu quote in here, always give your enemy somewhere to retreat to.
Yes, absolutely. Always give your enemy somewhere to retreat to. It's an odd quote, actually, because in Sun Tzu he actually contradicts himself, which leads people to think that Sun Tzu might have been written by at least more than one person.
Oh, yeah.
At least two.
I think so.
It's possible. It is about 3,000 years old, that book. But there is something to be said, because he also says, when you land on foreign lands, burn your boat, so you people, your soldiers have nowhere to go. Which might also it kind of reflects if your enemy has got somewhere to retreat to, they can lose heart in a battle and run off. If you don't have anywhere to retreat to, it's likely that you'll fight all the harder, because if you're going to lose, it means dying rather than being able to retreat. You're going to fight a little harder.
Sun Tzu in the Art of War is a great example of essentially antiquity thinking.
Yes.
In that's how they thought about warfare. And they thought about warfare as limited scale, as a war between soldiers, and as a war between men, and as a war between men with limited means of a limited cause, with a code of honor. And within the faceless machine of the managerial elite, within the faceless machine of mechanized war, again, which is only possible under the credit structure of something like central banking, you lose that. You lose that idea of honor. You lose the idea of man against man. You lose the idea of the limited rules of engagement. You lose the spirit of war in its classical sense. There's a lot of romanticizing of war, but some of that was actually true.
I wouldn't go writing it off completely.
How they like to think of themselves.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't go writing off Sun Tzu completely. I still say an awful lot of it is very relevant. Certainly relevant in business and various other things, but yes, I largely agree. Things have changed a lot.
Well, it's an example of how things really in warfare have changed for the worse.
Oh yeah, very much so. Very much so. It is horrendous, and the inclusion of the civilian populace as a valid military target is a horrendous affectation of the last 100 years and of the democratization process, the the state being the people, and therefore when you're at war with the state, you're at war with the general people. Is this my entire point altogether? Is, leave Mrs. Miggins' pie shop alone. Leave Bill and Ted and Bob to be goat herders and.
Dude.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Leave them. I know. I can't believe I just said Bill and Ted. but leave them to be, happy digging roads or whatever they're doing. Don't blow them up for some war. And also, don't conscript them and drag them off just for, essentially defending the oil money of some foreign country. The amount of American and English soldiers that have gone off that are currently absolutely distraught over this Afghan thing, going, what was the point of it all? Well, the point of it all is in Iraq and Afghanistan, etc., is that you died for a small group of people that are also very, very, very wealthy, and they don't have any intention of letting any of their family die for these things. But you've made them rich. Thank you very much. They've turned your son into pink mist. They've blown your legs off, and they've made money out of it.
Yes, it is. That's the point here. That really all of this is in the pursuit of greater power for a class of people. And as we talked about last time, it is a class of people that is, you get those in power, you get those who are part of the managerial state, and even those who are billionaires do not rival their standing because they are, it's a small club and you're not in it. Yes. We saw, again, I always bring up the example of Trump because he's a great example of how they view the outsider. And really, the Second World War is a war that is pursued by those people utilizing this new underclass. I mean, if you're a white-collar worker in America, you still have a good chance of being affected by the war still. If you're a white-collar worker in Britain, you have a good chance of being sent to war. If you're a white-collar worker in Poland, you're just kind of fucked. There is no strata of society that is insulated against the war apart from the managerial elites. Apart from, the people who are responsible for it. I don't want to break into a System of a Down song here, but essentially, you used to have it was a myth in many cases, but the myth of the general who led from the front, the king on the horse leading the charge. You used to at least expect that as the propaganda, but there was no expectation of, FDR even visiting the front. There was no real expectation of Winston Churchill visiting the front because it was seen as too insulated from it. His role was to be a manager. His role was not to be, a swaggering general, as much as he would like to portray himself as that. And the last thing I want to talk about, we've got about, I think we've got enough time here. I want to try and keep these under 2 hours because they're so dense, but it's a section I've just referred to as human sacrifice and nuclear fire, because once you start to mentally try and justify the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, you essentially say that they were acts of human sacrifice to the gods of peace. They were acts of human sacrifice essentially to the gods of democracy. Because if your view of the dropping of the nuclear bombs is that it shortened the war, it saved lives, and it brought about this era of peace, that what you are saying is that you are judging the lives of those who died in the dropping of the bombs as worth sacrificing for a hypothetical gain. And it really is, as I put down there, this really is the end point of utilitarianism on a mass scale. This is the end point of the justifying of mass death for the noble goal. It's really, well, we did this horrible thing, but we did it in pursuit of this good thing. Therefore, more good in the world, therefore good action.
Oh, yes. Yes, Japan had got the experience of what man become God looks like. Twice. Literally, they got the wrath of God. They got God-level weapons, end-game weapons, and they got to see it twice. Nobody's actually had them thrown at them in an act of war since. Unless you were, happened to be, unfortunately, on one of the islands in the South Pacific where America was testing them. And yes, they did leave some people on islands just to see what, just to see what it looks like. But yeah, oh my god, nuclear weapons are terrifying. And I say this as someone who grew up for far too long, 70s and 80s, with this is the sound of what 5 minutes before you die sounds like. When you hear this, run to your local bomb shelter if you have one nearby you, and if you don't, hide under your desk and curl up in a ball and kiss your ass goodbye. Essentially,
yeah. It's the necessity of like mass fear and mass consciousness. The Cold War, we'll get into that eventually, but the Cold War is a great example of that. The necessity of, it's what we see with COVID. COVID is the same thing. It's duck and cover is the same as wearing a mask. It's how I try to explain to people. It's like what you're doing is you're hiding under a desk from a nuclear bomb. If this really was as bad as they said it was, masks would never save you. They are a fig leaf. A literal mouth-based fig leaf. They are the duck and cover of pandemics. But people like to think that that the government telling them what to do is a good thing during a crisis. Therefore, the government will always say it's a crisis. There's a couple of Mises articles here. I know the first one you got up there is the atomic bombing of Japan reconsidered.
Yeah, I'm just going to put that image there. That image, as I said, I grew up with that, and I don't know, that is... It really does form a psyche that, to the point where at 10 years old, young Trig was writing to the British nuclear fuels and Greenpeace and various other companies and organisations about nuclear power, and trying to desperately find out and desperately work out for myself what nuclear power was about, and whether or not it really was the horrific nightmare that certain people were trying to tell you. Because I had grown up for 10 years under the fear that was what I was going to look up at any given moment and see.
That is very drilled into your generation, yes.
It's, you know what, it really does burn into your psyche, because even now I look at that and I am filled with certain emotions.
Well, that was one of the points of dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were practical demonstrations. I think that was their main point. Their main point was to bring home how powerful nuclear weapons were and to essentially scar the psyche of people. That is the full stop at the end of World War II. That an event like that really can't happen again with mutually assured destruction. So they have to find more inventive ways to keep populations engaged. Essentially, traditional war had run its course as a means of gaining state power, but it had accomplished its goals. Really, we've not had world wars since then because world wars don't serve the interests of the elites right now. As soon as they do, we'll have one again, which is not the most comforting thought. But yeah, the idea that it was world peace created by all this human cooperation on a national international scale is, I think, a misreading of history. One, traditional wars became unthinkable, and two, they were able to wrestle so much control from people during the Second World War that wars of that kind were no longer necessary. They had already won, and everything from that point on really was that we live in the crumbling remains of their victory lap because they don't know what the fuck they're doing and they don't have as much control as they think. But that really is why there has been quote unquote peace throughout this period, even though there really hasn't. There hasn't been a moment of peace for the average man throughout this. There has always been a crisis. But the dropping of the bombs. There's a great paragraph at the end of that if we want to get reading. The last paragraph in the article is pretty good, where it says, if you want to read it, it says, given all the uncertainty in the last paragraph there. I think it's like the third line.
God damn it! Hold on. Given all the uncertainty, both at the time and with modern historical revisionism, it is better to look to principle rather than fortune telling. One principle that should be near the top of everyone's list is this. Is it wrong to target civilians with weapons of mass destruction? I'm going to say yes. The deliberate killing of innocent women, men, women, and children by the hundreds of thousands cannot be justified under any circumstances, much less the ambiguous ones Truman encountered. Whether this decision was motivated by indignation towards the Japanese pig-headedness or concern for his troops, Truman's use of such devastating weapons against non-combatants should not be excused. Americans must strive for the complete and honest analysis of the past and present conflicts, and if she is to remain true to her own ideals, America must strive for more noble and moral ends in all conflicts, domestic and foreign, guided by our most cherished first principles, such as the Golden Rule. At the very least, Americans should try so hard to justify mass murder. Yes. Yeah.
There's the second one here, which is by John V. Denson. It's another Mises article called The Hiroshima Myth, in which he quotes quite a few good historical sources. There's a good quote here from New York Times journalist Harrison Baldwin. He concludes about the unconditional surrender policy, like we talked about earlier, that it was perhaps the biggest political mistake of the war. Unconditional surrender was an open invitation to unconditional resistance. It discouraged opposition to Hitler, probably lengthened the war, cost us lives, and helped to lead to the present aborted peace. He's talking about the Cold War. If your interest is in saving lives, if your interest is in least death, then unconditional surrender doesn't make any sense. But if your interest lay in, say, global government building, unconditional surrender makes a lot of sense. If you're actually looking to maximize the loss of life and the trauma from the war, unconditional surrender makes more sense there. There's also a great quote here. He's basically talking about the fact that there's a book called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb by Gar Alperovitz, let's say, which is a good book. I've got it on my reading list. I don't have it here because this quotes some good sections from it. Yeah, he gives us the answer in great detail to why was the bomb dropped, which can be summarized, which can't be summarized here. But he states, "We have noted a series of Japanese peace feelers in Switzerland, which OSS Chief William Dunham reported to Truman in May and June 1945. These suggested, even at this point, that the US demand for unconditional surrender might well be the only serious obstacle to peace. At the center of the explorations, as we also saw, was Alan Dulles, chief of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which kind of became the CIA. Yeah, subsequent director of the CIA. Yeah, in his 1996 book, The Secret Surrender, Dulles recalled that on July 20th, 1945, on instruction from Washington, I went to the Potsdam conference and reported there to the Secretary of War, Stimson, on what I'd learned from Tokyo. They desired to surrender if they could retain the emperor and their constitution as a basis for maintaining discipline and order in Japan after the devastating news of surrender became known to the Japanese people." Basically, it is a historical fact that the Japanese were desperately attempting to surrender before they were nuked. And one of the other obstacles was the Soviet Union being a bit weird about it. But the other obstacle was the fact that America was demanding unconditional surrender. And in the end, they were allowed to keep the emperor, and they had to get rid of the constitution, but they retained a modified version of it. In the end, basically what they were asking for was given to them. They just had to have nuclear weapons tested on them twice for it to happen. And really, once you realize that, there is no justification for the dropping of the atomic bombs, because Japan was already attempting to surrender.
Yeah.
The use of the atomic bombs really is justified in retrospect, and it's justified by the fact that they're at war with the nation of Japan. The nation of Japan is made up of the Japanese people. Therefore, harming the Japanese people is justified. That is the train of logic that is used to justify the atomic bombs, and it is the end point of total state thinking.
Thing is, they were actually at war with the Emperor of Japan. Understanding the Japanese would have saved a hell of a lot of lives in the Japanese war.
The thing is, I think they were willfully ignorant. They
had a new toy and they wanted to play with it.
Yes, they did.
And that is the absolute tragedy. And it broke the psyche of Japan.
That's how we end up with anime, yeah.
I was going to say, but we wouldn't have had Akira and so many post-apocalyptic animes without the nuclear bombs. And, as a bit of a weeb, there's something to be said for that, but I don't think it was worth the absolute horrifying sight that is Nagasaki and Hiroshima being annihilated. I mean, I did hear an interesting story about the Hiroshima bomb, though. That there was a girl who was working at the Hiroshima library, which was something like 300 meters from where the bomb went off. And she had gone to the basement to look for a particular book or something when the bomb was dropped. And so even though she was 300 meters from where the bomb was dropped, and she was underground in the basement of the library, and she was bounced from wall to wall and floor to ceiling when it went off. But she survived. To tell her story. She was at literally ground zero and survived to tell her story. Which also gives the idea that perhaps it is possible to survive this nightmare that is the nuclear bomb. And that maybe those bomb shelters there is something to be said for having them.
But a desk ain't going to do it.
Yeah,
that's what the desk is for, I guess.
I don't think the desk's gonna do it. I think you're gonna need to dig a big old hole. But yeah, no, she survived in the basement of a library, 300 meters, because the bomb was set to go off above the bridge, and the library was on one side of the bridge, because it was deemed that detonating it at something like 100 meters above the ground would
I'm going to say there's also liberals
effects.
Get the bullet too says nuclear weapons are very different than thermonuclear weapons, which is true.
Oh yeah,
they went from kilotons to megatons pretty quickly.
Oh, and you want to get me started on neutron bombs at some point, because neutron bombs are wild. Neutron bombs, they detonate in the upper atmosphere, in the atmosphere way above a city, and they bombard the entire area with neutron radiation. It's not the blast wave that is designed to kill you, it is the neutron radiation, and it will turn an entire area of 100 miles in radius plus into a neutron bombarded zone where everything in that within a week is going to die of rapidly growing tumors and liquefaction. Again, beyond horrendous.
There really is no free market demand for nuclear weapons.
No, they're horrendous. They're beyond horrendous. They are utter destruction.
If you are trying to seek profit in a classical sense, I mean, the British Empire would have no use for nuclear weapons, bar threatening people with them. Because their actual use is unprofitable, really.
Yeah, it's a weapon of ransom. It is, do as I say, or I'm going to use this. And that is in some respect.
Yeah, but the thing is, its use undermines its threat, because its use then makes, whatever area you're trying to invade basically useless, and you end up,
Well, that's the point of the neutron bombs. Yeah. That's literally the point of the neutron bombs, because the neutron radiation goes away quite quickly, but everything in the area, you basically go in a couple of weeks later with a large hose and a brush and sweep up and then take all the buildings. Not that, but there's nothing living there. And neutron bombs is an area denial weapon, but most of them are an area denial weapon of hundreds of years. But it's more a case of, do as I say, otherwise everyone died. And when the other side goes, well, do as I say, otherwise everyone dead, you get mutually assured destruction, which, as Magoot in chat points out, there's something to be said for it. It does kind of work. It's horrifying and it's terrifying, and
it's also a good argument as to the fact that since nuclear weapons now exist, that maybe they should be in private hands because that further discourages their use.
Oh, I don't know. The thing is with private hands is nutcase, but nutcase is nutcase.
Nutcase can also run government. So
nutcase frequently does run government.
It's quite funny, but no, the really, I guess in a free market sense, there really isn't much use for nuclear weapons. No. Just like people don't go around doing abhorrent things because they feel like it under normal circumstances.
I would also say biological weapons, weapons of fear and terror, like viral weapons that can turn the entire planet into a state of terror and then demand a vaccine that doesn't work, shouldn't be being researched either. Or released from a Chinese lab a year and a half ago. Sorry, did I say that out loud?
It functions. It functions in the same way, though. The fear of nuclear war, the fear of pandemic, the fear of an evil nationalist government invading you. Fear in general is one of the themes that we'll see throughout the next part of this whole thing.
Yeah,
and it really is the instilling of permanent fear, which is one of the most potent aspects of what became the post-war consensus. There is maybe a brief reprieve you can see in the 1990s, but the fear becomes more diffuse there. It kind of weird things happen in the 90s. It's going to be quite interesting when we look at them because the 90s are not what a lot of people remember them as behind the closed doors. But here we get to the real point of you couldn't have had the mass death in Hiroshima and Nagasaki without the Federal Reserve forming itself in 1913. I think we've successfully, hopefully, drawn a straight line here. You couldn't have the mass death without the spirit of democracy. I mean, Nagasaki and Hiroshima were perpetrated by what was supposed to be the leading light of liberal democracy in the world. That, liberal democracies drop nuclear weapons is the takeaway that we can have from this. The only country to use them is supposedly the most democratic and the biggest champion of democracy. Therefore, the use of nuclear weapons must be a democratic endeavor. If we ascribe deaths to communism, we can ascribe deaths to democracy. And I'm going to start. I know it will annoy people, but I am going to start doing that. It's a point of history that nuclear weapons were used by the world's, supposedly the world's self-declared leading democracy, and there is really no way around that. That's kind of fun. Is this Escape from New York?
That's Escape from New York. Yes, yeah. I watched it the other day. Just Mac 10 with 16 times scope on the suppressor is peak weapons technology as far as I'm concerned. Sorry, I will remove that. That wasn't meant to go up there. That was something else I was doing. Where am I? There we are. Hiroshima. Save. Yes. Sorry.
But yeah, there's also something I had there from NPR, which basically is about the fact that America tried to cover up the horrific truth of the nuclear weapons use, which seems to counteract the fact that they were comfortable with it, and is also a great impediment to quote-unquote democratic society, that, these weapons can be used in your name, and then the horrors of their use is covered up. That wasn't very democratic of you, Truman. But yeah, it's a case of really that you can see, like I said, nuclear weapons are the ultimate expression of total war. A total war is the ultimate expression of the total state. And the total state is the ultimate expression, really, of, at least in the modern sense, of democracy and managerialism. The modern liberal democracies, as we proved in other episodes, are very similar in function to communist or fascist states. In reality, they use different rhetoric and they use different means and they draw lines in different places, but the subsummation of populations and the rhetoric used and the tactics often used are identical. So is the way that economies are often run in times of crisis. And out of all of this, you get these horrific outcomes. You get the atrocities of Japan, you get the atrocities of Nazi Germany, you get the atrocities of the Soviet Union, but you also get the atrocities of the United States. And I don't think within this framework it is controversial to call the dropping of the nuclear weapons possibly the most horrendous war crime that's ever been committed, at least in a single day.
Yes, perhaps. There was an awful lot of innocent people just going about their daily business, turned into shadows, ash, and fleeting memories for no particular reason whatsoever that day. I might argue that what we've recently experienced from the Wuhan labs may top that.
Again, that is another discussion for another time, but it is similar. It is a very similar, the psychology of it and the way it is utilized is incredibly similar because it's essentially being done by the same class of people for the same reasons.
Yes, it is.
And that is a theme that we've always seen through this, that there are tragedies created and then tragedies exploited. And America creates the tragedy of nuclear weapons, and then for the next 40 years afterwards, at least, exploits the tragedy of nuclear weapons. And they helped create the tragedy of the Second World War, and then they exploited it for an indefinite period, the next century, it looks like. And all of this really, if you read history in certain ways, is undeniable. I'm sure there's people who disagree with them. I'm sure there's people who haven't come with us on this journey, but this is the end point. The end point of mass suffrage is the justification of dropping nuclear bombs on children. One leads. You can't deny causality. One led to the other. Whether it would inexorably lead to it is a different question. There is. I'm not talking about determinism. I'm talking about causality. I'm talking about what has happened, not what is meant to happen. But you can certainly say that if democracy as a system has pure outcomes, and if the people in charge of it are the pure servants of the people, as they must be because of universal suffrage by this point, then the pure will of the people must be nuclear fire annihilation. And I don't think most Americans would be comfortable with that being placed on their own heads. And that's where you get the real trading of rights there, and the real trading of, I guess, self-image, and that you lose yourself as a individual, as we talked about with the quote from Liberty or Equality, the Challenge of Our Time, where they talk about man being reduced to basically the cells in this great leviathan. They are a tiny part of a huge machine, and they are utterly dehumanized in mass democracies because their vote essentially doesn't count. You're essentially 1/7 billionth of a system, and that is all you are. If there were to be global democracy, and because you are 1/7 billionth of a system, you are also responsible for the system as a whole. Even though you have really essentially no influence on it, you're still a small part of it. And it's really is that a worthwhile trade-off to be considered responsible for actions that you functionally cannot influence? Again, I'd not to go on one of my rants again, but that's why I tell people not to vote, because that is reality. That in the UK you are one. I know there's 70 million. There's not 70 million voters, but you are one in tens of millions of voices. But you will in the end be held responsible for what those in charge do if you follow that process and if you follow the logic of democracy to its inevitable end, which is that you as a human being are literally responsible for the actions of others that you have no functional control over. And I think that's an extremely tragic way that people think about themselves. Never mind the actual functional outcomes of democracy. I think the way that people think about themselves within a democracy is incredibly strange and alien and damaging. But we're kind of running out of time here. We're already quarter past already. So.
No, but you are more than entitled to go on a rant after the amount of rants I've had during this series. The occasional rant is good. It's good. Speaking from the soul you shouldn't restrict yourself. I don't.
Well, the American people's defense of nuclear war and the dropping of nuclear weapons is like the ultimate form of democracy cope.
Yeah.
At least if those in charge were recognized as autocrats, they could point to them and go, those people don't represent me. I don't feel comfortable with that. But because they feel responsible for voting and putting people in charge, they almost have to defend their actions. I think that's where a lot of the defense of the use of nuclear weapons comes from, because they see themselves as a collective. And that wasn't an action taken by a general or a president. That was an action taken by the embodiment of the will of the people. Therefore, they must defend it. That is the psychological impact of subsuming yourself in democracy.
It really do be that. No, it doesn't. That.
But anyway, I'm going to say thank you guys for tuning in. Thanks for sticking with us for this. I know this wasn't the best promoted because it has the word war in the description, and YouTube decides to heavily derank anything that mentions controversial topics. It happened in our totalitarian special, I think, too. But a lot of people, I think, will view this in the VOD. So thank you for finding this. Thank you. I know you have to seek us out these days because we generally do get quite deranked. And I've stopped promoting my stuff in certain circles because I'm frankly quite sick of some of those people, but I don't want to turn this to a drama channel, as some people sometimes choose to do. Not this channel, but I mean YouTube channels in general.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for the donations, those who've donated. Thank you for buying tickets, those who've bought tickets to the event that I'll be hosting in October. Shill.
I will certainly be there.
Yes. Do you have anything to shill, Trig? Because I kind of got my shilling done at the beginning.
You know what? I am going to show something because I am going to do yet another. I am attempting yet another D&D session with some people, with some friends of mine.
Another one.
Yeah, I know. This one. I. You know what? I think it might happen, and if it does happen, I'm going to stream it on my channel, and I'm also going to get back to playing Deus Ex because I nearly got to Paris and then stopped. So hopefully that should come up in the next week. But the reason for that was basically anyone that was watching it, I hurt my hands again because I have shitty, knackered, crap hands and I can't play computer games when they go, and they failed me, and then all manner of crap happened in my personal life. Blah blah blah. Boo-hoo me. But yeah, D&D on Mondays, guys. Should be fun. Other than that, I think. Yeah. Sign up and join us in October.
Have a good one, guys. That's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. Good night.